restrooms are across the hall. Okay. And of course, if we have any time left over, we will have open mic poetry for those of you who would like to read your poetry. So without further ado, I guess I'll get started. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about our guest reader tonight. Dr. John Telford is a retired Detroit educator as well as a poet and author. Dr. Telford served at the top administrative levels in several local school districts, including Detroit Public Schools. In the 1950s, he outran Olympic champions as an All-American sprinter on the U.S. national team. He is a member of the Athletic Hall of Fame at Wayne State University, which named him its Distinguished Alumnus of the Year in 2001 for his civil rights activism. You can hear Dr. Telford speak on his radio show, The John Telford Show, on Sundays from 1:45 to 2 p.m. on WGPR 107.5 FM. This evening, Dr. Telford will share his 2 books with us. What Old Men Knew, a definitive dictionary and almanac of advice, and A Life on the Run, Seeking Justice. So without further ado, let us bring up Dr. John Telford.
Thank you, Mildred. I guess now it's my time to do some talking, right? Ms. V is going to hand out some flyers. And my publisher, the flyers advertise both of my books. And my publisher has told me that for this August body, he will allow me to autograph books and put the books in your hand without you giving us any cash. If you fill that thing out and mail it to him, and then he will send you an invoice for one or both of the books. Now, I guess I have to do a little talking to advertise the books before I can convince you that these books are worth buying. But naturally, I think they are because I wrote them. But other folks may not be as so approving of that particular opinion. But A Life on the Run, which is my autobiography, does come highly recommended by several folks. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about A Life on the Run today because I'm going to let you read my life story for yourself. So when you have this book in your hands, you'll be holding my life in your hands. Right now, you're just holding an advertisement for my book in your hand. So here comes any high school guy who is an old colleague of mine wandering in. I see several folks in the audience today, distinguished folks. I'm not going to introduce you distinguished folks because somebody will say that I overlooked another person who's a distinguished folk. But on the cover of the book is the word spellbind on the front of my book, A Life on the Run, Seeking and Safeguarding Social Justice. And the man that wrote that word is Dennis Archer. So I was very fortunate to have Dennis Archer recommend my book. Hugh Perkins has recommended this book. Jeffrey Feiger has recommended this book. Ken Cockrell has recommended this book, partially because his dad was a friend of mine, so I think he felt he needed to do me that favor. Professor John Powell, the executive director of the Kirwan Institute for Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University, has recommended this book. Actually, he says, quote, as a suburban school superintendent, John Telford stood steadfast in the fearsome face of race. I thought that was a nice quote, and my publisher put it on the back of that cover. The president of the Detroit Federation of Teachers, Keith Johnson, recommended the book. Spencer Haywood, who was my high jumper and shot putter at Pershing High when I was coaching 45 years ago, Hester Wheeler, who at the time was the director of the Detroit Mandeville ACP, as recommended before. So it comes fairly highly recommended. And if I have some time at the end of this little presentation, I may share some things from the Life on the Run. Well, you know what, maybe I will share just a little bit from the Life on the Run before I move on to the Run. On page, let's see, on page 402 of the Life on the Run, which is actually in the epilogue, I read, my old foes, classism, racism, and segregation still strangle the Detroit metropolitan area and persist throughout America. A Medicare program that already was headed toward bankruptcy suffers under an even worse burden imposed on it by the recent Republican Congress, which had managed to turn a $155 million federal surplus amassed by the Clinton administration into an astronomical federal debt by the end of the ruinous George W. Bush era. The income gap between America's haves and have-nots, black or white, is a widening chasm. Poverty and illiteracy still poison our inner cities throughout the United States. Michigan, for example, faces a nearly insurmountable deficit and has no way now to upgrade, maintain, or even sustain education and social services for Detroit, its largest, poorest city, let alone its other cities. And of course, this breaks my heart, being a native Detroiter and having lived here for 75 years, and seeing a governor now that's cut, referred to deep cuts into K-12 education. I mean, we need to shore up K-12 education, not cut it anymore, particularly in areas like Detroit, and Inkster, and Pontiac, and Saginaw, and all of the center cities that are suffering so grievously. My state ranks last in employment and first in population loss. My hometown, with a teeming ghetto no farther away from across the street where I live, has again been named America's most dangerous city. The nationwide drug trade proliferates. International and domestic terrorism are growing threats, as is the possibility of biochemical and nuclear war. After a generation of speculative corporate self-seekers on their obsessive chase of evanescent profiteering disprove once and for all the existence of a benignly self-corrective business cycle, the stock market is now in free fall internationally. You know, this is some bad news I'm sharing with you guys that you're already familiar with. You know, I'm not going to, I don't think I'm going to read anymore from this particular portion of the Life on the Run because it's kind of depressing. You know, we all know what's happening to our city and our state and our country, but we have to find ways to turn this situation around. Now, in this next book, What Old Men Know, which really hasn't hit the marketplace yet. This is a 2011 book that's just coming out. Hanson Clark has already ordered 5 boxes of this book, and he has promised that he's going to put a copy into the hands of every Democratic congressman. But the congressmen who really need, and congresswomen who really need to have this book in their hands are the Republican congressmen, because they're dominating the Congress right now numerically, and they're also doing the same thing with our legislature in Lansing. And unless we can do something to turn this runaway government around and get it back focusing on education, I really don't see how we can turn the city and the state and the country around, particularly right now, our city, where we all reside. There are, well, here, let me, Wayne Dyer, Dr. Wayne Dyer, who's a native Detroiter, by the way, writes, pervasive wisdom, a must-read. That's what he says about What Old Men Know, a definitive dictionary, an almanac of advice. And Wayne has written several things praising this book. Jerry Kedley just came in here, Carl Wagner, principal, football coach, track man, so all these old faces. Jerry and I ran some of the record relay for 55 years. Welcome. Dr. Dyer said, in his youth, John bullied bullies, now ran Olympic champions, which is something that nobody already mentioned. Now, nearly 60 years later, they rightfully named the track after him, and he's still sprinting full speed on his righteous track. Now, that's Dr. Wayne Dyer, author of the national bestseller, Your Erroneous Zones, Pulling Your Own Strings, The Sky's the Limit. And he wrote the introduction to this book, and I'm going to share some of the things that he said. Brad Edwards writes about this book. He was on Channel 2 until he went to Indiana, and he's a 6-time Emmy-winning news writer. Wrote Road Before Going Rogue became a roaring cliche. Dr. John Telford is a rebel-esque sage whose captivatingly anecdotal dictionary has hilarity, philosophy, chutzpah, reams of rare advice, and much more in this panoramic look at life from the left and beyond. They always call me a left-winger. I always considered myself a centrist, but I guess maybe you're I'm in the center of the left. Okay? I'm a Kennedy Democrat. If I'm a radical, the Constitution of the United States is radical. Maybe it was. I guess it was in 1776. All men and women, he writes, old and young, need to know what old men know. It's part words to live by, part words to die laughing by. Brad Edwards wrote that. Telford Harris, who's a prominent Detroit poet, and we've got some prominent poets in the room today. Wardell Montgomery is here, for example. There's poets in Detroit. Where is Wardell? He's one of the great ones. But Telford Harris, who's a Detroit poet and philosopher, says, Dr. John Telford redefines the linguistics of the day, humorously and bluntly, while advancing the imperiled cause of universal human rights. His unique perspective on life, passion, politics, psychology, parapsychology, education, ecology, sociology, and other elements within the human experience is courageous and full of wit. He is an inspirational spirit I respect as a man, a fellow writer, a refreshingly original and creative thinker, and a fearless fighter for all humanity. All members of both political parties or no political party who care about our earthly survival need to own, read, and refer to this spellbinding book. Interestingly, Bob Samaras, whom I coached with and coached against in the old days, he coached Reggie Harding and all those great athletes at Old Eastern High School before he became coach of the University of Windsor and won the national championship over in Canada. And he's a Republican, by the way. But he's my friend. I was hoping he could be here today, but his wife was having some health problems. He couldn't make it. But he wrote, if one is able to disregard some of its scathingly hilarious and not always entirely tongue-in-cheek vitriol and scatology, he uses big words like me, but scatology means it's raunchy, okay? Aimed at Republicans, he's a Republican, one will discern immediately that what old men know is far more than a satirically definitive dictionary. It is a cautionary and socially definitive masterpiece. Boy, I love that word. Masterpiece that our nation's beleaguered leaders, Democrats, Republicans alike, need to heed and to read from cover to cover. Dr. Robert T. Samaras, Professor of Education, retired Wayne State University. John Conyers writes, this satirical and memorably quotable new dictionary will delight all Democrats with a small d and a capital D. It will also infuriate some Republicans. But once they pick it up, either Democrat or Republican will put it down. I'm not so sure about that, but maybe the Republican will be curious to see what we wrote about. I'll share, some of this in here. Josh Bassett says he's a professor at Wayne County College. A definitive dictionary for life and living that is in turn hilarious, poignant, and profound. I got another thing. Hugh Perkins, and Carl Wagner, who's sitting over here, says, self-styled Ald author Telford's pithy almanac is electrifying. We get the Ald in there because I'm was Scott, and he's got the Scottish logo in here. My father was born in Scotland. Free Press calls it sensational, but it really didn't. They called this book sensational, and I quoted that in here. Actually, my publisher quoted it in here. Sensational. Telford is a hero, summary, obtained others. Detroit Free Press, in April 18, 2010. Review of the author's autobiography. www.elifeontherun.com. Hanson Clark says it's more explosive than my memoirs. Stuart Kirschenbaum says something very nice. He was a Michigan boxing commissioner. And Tom Watkins says Telford's linguistic style is hypnotic. He is a former superintendent of public instruction. So I've got some pretty high-powered folks here who have said some good things about the book. At the beginning of the book, in the very frontispiece page, I put this quote from the book of Job. Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Where is the way to the dwelling of light? And where is the place of darkness? In 1887, aged sage T.H. Huxley observed that the known is finite. The unknown is infinite. Intellectually, Huxley wrote, we stand on an islet in the midst of an illimitable ocean of inexplicability, unexplainability. Our business in every generation is to reclaim a little more light. That's what educators try to do. A century later, the sagacious Carl Sagan, in his masterwork Cosmos, assured us that while alien civilizations may not share a spoken and written language, all technical civilizations, even extraterrestrial ones, and I'm sure that they do exist, do share a common language, the absolute law of science and mathematics. Faraway galaxies, spinning around one another, follow the same laws of gravitational physics as govern the motion of an apple falling to Earth or a Voyager on its way to the stars. Sage for the ages, Blaise Pascal reminded us in his Pensies that we must seek our dignity from the government of our thought, that we should have no greater measure of dignity even were we to possess worlds which can swallow us up like grains of sand. Thus, it is by knowledge and by thought that we contemporary aged sages comprehend our expansive and ever-expanding world. I dedicated this book to my father, and I write in the foreword of the book, near the dawn of the 20th century, my own personal old man, John Scotty Telford, an only briefly schooled coal miner and prize fighter, but avid student of world affairs, was born in Scotland. He ultimately would become an octogenarian. I still have 5 years before I make that honor, if I make it that far. Gary, you think we're going to make it that far? We're both 75 years old. We'll try. During 1902, the year of my father's birth, the United States selected Panama as the site of a canal joining the world's two great oceans. The Texaco Oil Company was established in America, and there was a massive miners' strike, also in America. My grandfather was one of the forerunners of the Mountain Warriors. I don't know if anyone ever heard of that miners' organization. They were kind of an underground organization. His home got burned down by the miners. There's all kind of bad stuff happened to him. On Egypt's Nile River, the first Aswan Dam was completed in 1902. Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories and Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness were published, and Rodin sculpted his Romeo and Juliet. There's a copy of that out in front of the Detroit Institute. And in the foreword, I talk about many other things that happened between then and now. And then I get to a little more modern time toward the end of the foreword, and I say, the father-son duo of Republican presidents have led the United States into wars and other travails. The father into that 1991 war over oil, the son into a falsely premised similar war over oil and into a worldwide financial meltdown. They're forgetting that he did that now. They're blaming it all on Obama. But that was the 8 years of misrule
and Sons administration, contracts were signed with British Petroleum, BP, that have resulted in unsafe drilling, which caused a massive oil leak on the ocean floor of the Gulf of Mexico. You know, you forget that real fast. You know, that had us all scared to death, and it's still causing incredible ecological problems. A recent series of earthquakes has shaken the planet. You can't blame that on Bush, I guess. Terrorism and nuclear.
I do.
Let's do. Terrorism and nuclear proliferation have become dire threats. Sea piracy has resurged. The impact of global warming and the depletion of the planet's ozone layer have encroached, caused by our overuse of fossil fuel. In the midst of all this, America's first mixed-race president, serendipitously an intellectual and spiritual throwback to the brilliant and courageous JFK, has been elected to lend our nation and the free world some sorely needed wisdom, hope, and plain rationality. Let's hope to God he does. Concurrently, China has emerged as a formidable economic and military power. Much of this I set forth specifically and comment on items in this publication and in my autobiography, A Life on the Run, Seeking and Safeguarding Social Justice. Together, the lives of my late father and me have spanned nearly 98% of the tumultuous 20th century, and buoyed by his indomitable and enduring spirit, I have now survived under the threshold of the second decade of the potentially even more tumultuous 21st. We have all survived to that point. Having been a student and sycophant who sat at the knee of that wise and well-read, albeit unheralded, aged sage, also named John Telford, who sired me, does not alone qualify me to author this audacious volume which you discerning readers are about to digest, assuming you buy the book. Still, my privileged status of student sycophant to my valiant old man, literally, bears enormous weight nonetheless, as you will presently note. My father taught me histories, both ancient and merely old, that aren't to be found entirely in books. Histories that can impact the future of our species through examples both positive and negative. The 20th century was a period of unprecedented change. A cataclysmic 100 years whereof my fighter father and I have been not only products, but in our own minute and microcosmic avenues, catalysts. What old men know is a sensitive product of the 20th century experience and a, quote, galvanizer of good for the 21st. While I do confess to having an inordinate amount of democratic fun in it at the expense of some of my fellow Americans of the Republican persuasion. This, for the greater part, is a serious work that is yours to read and be therefore edified, uplifted, and morally motivated, regardless of your political views. And for the information of any Republicans who read this, the correct word here is indeed regardless, not irregardless. Thus, all of them, all of you, all of us may thereby help to shape the preferred future of humankind in the 21st century, as well as for the centuries to come. John Telford, Doctor of Education, Detroit, Michigan, 4th of July, 2010. Now, that's when I wrote this. Now, Wayne Dyer wrote the introduction. And this is his introduction by Dr. Wayne Dyer, one of this pulsating publication's duly anointed aged sages, and he is one, believe me. He writes, what old men know is indeed a daringly definitive, but also a very different kind of dictionary. Yet like a dictionary, one can read it from beginning to end from any part in the middle. It's, quote, all author. I call myself an all author, I get the Scottish word for all. It's all author has quirkily chosen to alphabetize prominent or timelessly famous and infamous people by their first names, rather than their last, and citing their deeds and misdeeds in this definitive dictionary. He differentiates old men capitalized from their old men not capitalized, in conferring upon the former the august title, aged sage. A veritable aged sage himself, he was my track coach in 1958 in Detroit, and I became his associate coach at Detroit Pershing High 8 years later. So, since he's proclaimed me one of his aged sages, At least I can suggest that while over time, I've hopefully acquired a modicum of sagacity. I'm not quite as aged as he is yet. Seriously, John Telford prodded me to pursue my doctorate and the edited my dissertation. Much of what I have accomplished I owe to his mentorship, as do countless others whose lives he touched in his half-century as an educator, which he recounts in his incendiary autobiography, A Life on the Run, Seeking and Safeguarding Social Justice. You will enjoy Dr. Telford's references to a reformative process he calls creative insubordination. That's my next book, by the way. Creative Insubordination. Book number 1, 2, 3. Actually, book number 4. So I wrote a book on track a long time ago. This was my fourth book. My fourth publishing. I've got another one published. But you will also find me less poke fun at the distaff side of the human equation. I don't know, maybe I'm a little chauvinistic, but I do have a little fun with ladies sometimes. You know, and as well as at Republicans. Hence, as he would say, Republicans, check your Websters. At times he gets rather graphically explicit about us oldsters failing bodily functions, and perhaps a tad too cute when he makes sly implications regarding the size, or rather the implied lack thereof, of the private parts of male members of the GOP. Also, his blunt use of slang synonyms for reproductive or excretory organs in characterizing individuals whose politics differ from his may discomfit some readers. I think it made Bob Samaras a little uncomfortable, to tell you the truth. But anyway, he